Welcome back to the Designing Sustainable Futures webinar series. In today's session, I'm very honored to facilitate a conversation between three experts on...
Sorry,
Yeah.
my bad. We'll take it from the top.
Okay.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Welcome back to the Designing Sustainable Futures webinar series. In this session, I'm honored to facilitate a conversation with three global experts focusing on the topic of leading the transition. As we heard in session one, it's critical to have a shared vision of a sustainable future. As we heard in our second session, it's essential to create the experiences of that preferred future. And today we're going to be talking about how do you mobilize people? Leadership is about bringing people together for collective action. We can have a better or a preferred future. We can create and design those more sustainable products and services. But if people aren't aligned, if people aren't willing to work together to actually make some of the hard decisions to implement those more sustainable experiences, then that better future will never happen. It'll never be brought to the present. So today I'm with Dasha Kvinos, who is the CEO of the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, and she's been leading foresight initiatives both at the Institute and also in her role at Maersk, which we're going to be hearing about. Loes Damhof is the UNESCO Chair in Futures Literacy, and she's been working across the globe, bringing leaders to develop these futures capabilities, to be actually futurists on the ground, to make things happen. And I'm very excited to have Shakil Ahmed, who is dialing in from Dhaka. He's a transformative educator who has contributed to some of the educational reforms in Bangladesh, which is one of the most, I believe, important case studies in the book. So thank you all for joining us. Let's start by having a conversation about Chapter 7, the first chapter in Part 3, Leading the Transition. It's all about collaboration. And for many of us who are practitioners or academics or any professionals, we always think collaboration has to happen. Co-creation has to happen. And I'd like to start, Dasha, by asking you, in your experiences, is this assumption always right?
Well, I'm a trained economist, so I have to say it depends. But it really does depend, because on the one hand, the old cliche is true. If you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together, right? So it also depends on what the process is about. But as you and I discussed this morning, I think in order to facilitate change and create change, I think ultimately you're going to have people follow you or be on board. And the easiest way to do that is actually bring them in to the actual process of designing whatever it is you guys are headed towards. And I think ultimately you and I discussed a family as a potential metaphor. So as much if a family is a project, right? And it's a long-term vision, and it usually takes two people to spend a couple of years understanding what kind of a process and vision is it they have, what kind of family do they want to be, and then gradually, over time, you start bringing in new people. It'd be kids, one at a time, sometimes more. Then you start bringing in in-laws and grandparents. But if you don't have that core vision between the two of them, then it may become a little bit messy. But after that, the addition of new collaborators and new ideas and new ways of doing things is only adds value. And it incrementally improves it, but you need that core. So I think the answer would be yes. Collaboration is almost always the right way to go, but you need to pace it. You need to, as you also discuss in the book, right? You need the right people to engage and enter the process at the right time, because if you don't, or you bring in someone prematurely, that may simply just sidetrack the vision, the project, and waste time or even lead it to nowhere.
Right. Well, it's interesting, the analogy with family. And so I'm curious, Loes, was there a situation or an example where that collaboration didn't work, where that creation of an extended family, which happens in many families, unfortunately, didn't work?
Oh, yeah. By the way, very happy to be here. So thank you for this opportunity to be part of this conversation. Yeah, I've been facilitating spaces where people share future images and negotiate share meaning of possible, probable, impossible futures for quite some time now, all over the world. And yeah, there's definitely been some cases where it just didn't work. And I would say the work that I do in future literacy, we start the process before the actual design. So before you actually come together and start brainstorming and designing and sharing a vision, I think the important question is, what do we see individually before we start talking about a shared vision? And I remember one example that I would not name the organization, but it was a governmental organization. We talked about beforehand, say, before we start designing the sustainable future together, let's really talk about what are we not seeing? What are some of our assumptions about the future? Because we might think that we have the same vision about what that sustainable future might be, but let's explore the underlying biases and differences, etc. And I'm always advocating for a capability of future literacy. So really explore, slow down for a minute, and think, if we share multiple futures, what are some of the blind spots that come up? And I really believe in collaborating in this kind of process. And for me, that's all about managing expectations. So if you want to introduce a different way of thinking, you have to make sure that people actually want to adopt a different way of thinking. So if you want to talk about change, you have to make sure that people are actually open to change. And that's, people are very easy to say, yes, that sounds great. We have to do something fundamentally different. But in my experience, everybody wants change, but not everybody wants to change. So in this particular case, it was very clear from the beginning, through very long conversations, exploring the field, who are the stakeholders, who do we invite to the table, is everybody on board, that we really want to fundamentally examine some of our assumptions and biases regarding the future. And everybody said, oh yes, this is exactly what we want. One of the local champions actually followed a training of mine. So I was pretty confident that this would be a home run. But during the process, which was a workshop, several days, it turned out that the stakeholders were not happy at all. So instead of being more engaged in exploration, they really wanted a certain outcome from the beginning. And halfway through, they communicated that as well, saying that this is way too open, this is way too abstract, this is way too, we need to get to a certain result and end destination. And this was one of the times that I thought, okay, apparently somewhere down the line, somewhere we were not on the same page. And I think it really taught me to let go of that assumption as well, that if you want to explore different ways of thinking, I have to let go of that particular scenario as well. So for me, collaboration is about two things. It's about trusting each other's intentions. That's really important along the line. And the other one is that always willing to make the other person look good. That has a lot of similarities with improv, and always willing to let go of whatever preconceived notion of a scenario you have in mind. Are you willing to let go and step into emergence in the moment?
Very interesting to hear that through that experience, it triggered your own reflection as a practitioner of, well, I might need to let go of some scenarios that you believe would be right, and certainly the conception of how do we collaborate, when do we collaborate, and being flexible about that. Dasha, you had also mentioned this morning you had an experience as well where the collaboration wasn't exactly ideal. Would you mind sharing that?
Are we talking about the scenario development?
Yes.
Yes. It wasn't even so much the collaboration element. It was more actually I neglected as you said, Loes, a little bit, I neglected other people's expectations towards the process, and I kind of pursued I was younger. I wasn't that young anymore, but I was younger, meaning I was so focused on delivering something that was correct and convincing that I forgot what the objective was. So this is about being tasked with a risk assessment task, where we had to basically look at the risk picture for the larger vessels in the company. And being placed in a group function means that we weren't very close to any of the businesses, but yet the task landed with us, and we came up with several scenarios, a very solid analysis, and we came down to present it. And we were so convinced that the arguments and the facts would speak for it that we just basically felt if we lay it out and we can substantiate with data, we'll be fine. One of the scenarios we presented was a theoretical scenario where a vessel could get stuck in the middle of the Suez Canal blocking traffic. And since I could basically prove that all of this was plausible, we kind of expected that whoever was in the room would entertain the scenario and talk about the risk management part of it. That was the idea, right? We can just acknowledge this as a risk, and then we can talk about how to mitigate it. What met me instead was this emotional wall of this can't happen. So it became more a question of how people felt about the scenario, whatever emotions they kind of ignited, rather than the actual plausibility of the event. So ultimately, bottom line is that we never even discussed the risk. It was dismissed. The analysis, I'm not going to say ridiculed, but a little bit, because there was so much experience within the actual sector in the room that they were unwilling to discuss something that was so unpleasant that we ended up dismissing it. And for me, that became a lesson in that it's not so much about having the right points. It's not about being right, but it's about walking into a room prepared for the emotional response. So
Emotions, yeah.
how is it going to make them feel? And I think that goes probably for all collaboration. It's not about getting a point across, but it's also, if you really want to get it across, you need to preempt how is it going to make other people feel, because you risk taking 3 steps back if you just lay it out. So I think for me, that was a big lesson learned, that facts, data is not enough, and the experts in the room may just be as biased because it evokes some sort of feeling.
Right, right. And we'll talk in a minute about feelings related to stories. I'm very curious, Shakil, Dasha mentioned her younger self, and maybe her younger self was more focused on the facts and less the emotions. I'm really curious, Shakil, in your experiences, how do you introduce that emotional aspect of collaboration when educating practitioners, and those practitioners may be the next generation of practitioners, as in the case of some of your work in Bangladesh?
Yeah, I mean, I think several different aspects are like bouncing off just based on that question, right? And I think I'll talk about listening in the first place, right? Because a big part of facilitating spaces is listening, and I think, I mean, of course, there's also Otto Scharmer's different levels of listening that also come to mind, right? Like listening, just downloading goes through one ear, comes out the other. Listening with an open mind, listening with an open heart, and listening with an open will. And I think sometimes, of course, apparently most of the time we operate in a way that we just are listening with an open mind or just downloading. But how much do we actually listen to how people are feeling, or even what futures are kind of engaged? And I think you're right. Like, I think, I guess in several different experiences, sometimes we can be very transactional, right? Like, oh, we just need to get things done. But sometimes that's not enough, right? Because at the end of the day, I think we talk about this whole concept of like network entrepreneurship in the book, and this whole spirit of like collaboration being based on trust and trust-based relationships, right? If trust doesn't exist for any complex challenge, you need collaboration among multiple actors. If trust doesn't exist among some actors, then the collaboration ultimately fails, right? And I think, and of course, how do we actually end up building trust? And of course, there's different people who talk about stuff like that. I think there's also Rachel Botsman talking about how to improve, how to have she defines trust as a confident relationship with the unknown. So actually, how do you actually improve your relationship with uncertainty? So not to increase transparency and just depend on that because that comes from a place of mistrust. But how do I trust people that I don't know what they're going to do, but you still yet trust them? And of course, people like Brené Brown talk about this whole idea about authenticity, vulnerability, the idea of that we need to actually keep our ego in check and let it go and open ourselves. And that's also definitely an emotional process, isn't it? Right? To be vulnerable. And I think in collaboration, I mean, that's important. I mean, of course, you won't know what happens as a result of that vulnerability, but you can test it out. And I think the last thing I'll talk about, this idea of the pressure cooker comes in, right? Like, how much do you actually push people and how much do you actually take it easy and be polite, right? And I think this is also comes from adaptive leadership, doesn't it, right? Like this idea that if you push too hard, then people will just get annoyed and they just get out of the room. But if you push too little, then no change is going to happen. So even on that sense, if you are able to build trust with each other, then at least we can push each other a bit more because we will feel safe. I know that we might feel a bit uncomfortable, a bit annoyed, but that's okay because we trust each other that ultimately we're doing it for the sake of the mission that we've aligned on. So I guess that's where the emotional stuff comes up for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that all that, you just used the word emotion. High levels of emotional intelligence are required to cultivate collaboration. And I know certainly from my own experiences, also my younger self, it's a challenge to maintain that with the excitement and enthusiasm of the future. And for all of us as practicing foresight practitioners, there's excitement, there's enthusiasm, and in many situations, there's a strong belief that the technology, certainly for those that are more inclined to be techno-optimists, that the technology is going to bring us to that better future. I'm very curious, Loes, in your work specifically on futures literacy, have you been able, in your experiences, to help cultivate awareness and the right balance between excitement, enthusiasm about the future against the needs, as Shakil, you've very articulately described, to build trust, to listen intently, to demonstrate adaptive and authentic leadership? Are those conflictual as you're trying to inculcate and develop the competencies of futures literacy?
No, I don't think they're conflicting at all. I think, first of all, I rarely in my work talk about optimism or pessimism or better futures or worse futures. For me, in my work, it's about cultivating capability, and I have no judgment or preference or idea or thoughts about other people's futures. In my experience, someone's dream might be someone else's nightmare. And I think for me, it's always about captivating diversity and the differences in multiple futures, because that's how we learn and that's how we get to see our blind spots and our assumptions. So I wouldn't, some people, I would say, years ago before COVID, my students tend to be more optimistic about the future. Now that is slightly changed for several reasons. That's an idea that I have. But for me, it's all about opening up a dialogue and discuss differences and some of the underlying values that we might have, and without judgment at all. And I think using future images is a great tool to do that. So it really creates trust because no one is an expert, right? I always ask people to share futures about 50 or 60 years from now, so no one really knows. Last night I was at a symposium about the freedom of speech at campuses, which was with a lot of students, which was a very emotional topic. It was by the University of Amsterdam. We've had a lot of riots and unrest and protests last few months. And I really described it as a way to talk about something that might be a bit sticky or difficult or uncomfortable. But if you share future images that no one has expertise on, the element of power diminishes a little bit. It doesn't really matter where you're students or a dean of a faculty. If you sit next to each other, no one really owns. So for me, that is really about what future literacy and sharing futures is all about. It's about creating that openness and finding a crack explore differences and assumptions, and through that, trying to see the present a little bit differently, and also trying to see it a little bit from each other's eyes. And whether is one person is more optimistic, another person is more pessimistic, I try to stay away of these kind of normative descriptions, because they differ per person, and frankly, and for me too, they can differ per hour too. So I see the future as a lot more fluid, and I try to use that to really highlight the differences, and at the same time come to the conclusion that ultimately we're not that different at all if it really comes down to what we really desire. So,
And you mentioned the importance of having those images, very reminiscent of Fred Pollock's statement about the importance of societies having an image of the future, and if they don't have that, then that puts their society into significant risk. I'm curious, Dasha, your experiences about images, those futures, and we're starting to get into some storytelling and story making as well.
Yeah, if I can just quickly segue a little bit on what Loes said, because some of the words, and I mean some of the words, especially like assumptions and the being future agnostic, especially if you're a facilitator, because I think very often also, given the times we live in, probably since the financial crisis, I'm often being told after I give a keynote, like, oh my God, the future looks so gloomy. And that's not the point, right? First of all, I think we need to remember that the present and the future are neutral. And it sounds really harsh to some people as we're experiencing uncomfortable change, but we have to remember that whatever's happening in the world right now that we in the Northern Hemisphere don't find particularly comfortable is someone's idea of a better future. I mean, just on a global scale, it's sometimes it's a zero-sum game, and that's the problem, right? That it becomes a question of better future for who. But I think this neutrality, buying into the idea that the future is neutral. And if you want a different future than the one you're looking into, then you have to start making these stories and these images, because otherwise you're going to, if you do what you've always done, you're going to end up where you're going, right? So I think that's the important part. So if you want something else, then let's start talking about where is it you want to go, because one future or another will transpire, and there's somebody who thinks this is better. You may not like it, but they do. The other one is about assumptions, and I think for me, and I'm derailing a bit of it, but I think it's extremely important, because very often when we talk to people, especially if they finally buy into having a vision and a future image or whatever it is, and they disagree, I always take them back and say, you guys don't disagree on the future, you disagree on the assumptions you make on your way. So basically, if you were to line up 100 people and say anyone who thinks globalization will continue, take a step forward. Everyone who thinks globalization is decoupling, take a step back. Fine. Then anyone who thinks we're going to have more children, take a step to the right. Anyone who thinks we're going to have less children, take a step to the left. And so on and so on. And before you know it, they're going to be spread all the way across the room. And not because they have different visions for the future, but because they have different ideas of certain developments, right? So these are the assumptions, and that's what usually sets us apart, right? So we'll be at these crossroads and someone go left and someone go right. The differences start there, not in where we see ourselves 10 years from now. And I think that's why it's about the assumptions. And I think it's extremely important to talk about those instead, because before they snowball into, we don't see the future the same way. So I think sometimes and then people have a far more tangible, solid discussion is, okay, why do you think we're going to have less children? Because I see it differently, and it becomes more constructive sometimes, right? So I think that's, for me, the assumptions are, I've coined my own term, the devil is not in the details, it is in the assumptions, because where we end up in that room is ultimately decided by these tiny steps we make in separate directions. So that was, sorry, I just had to
No, very important.
Because I fully agree that the future, I mean, yes, you do. Sometimes you have optimists and pessimists, but most of the time it's just because it does mean different. Everybody wants a better future. We just have different interpretations of what that is. The other word was comfortable, and I think Shakil, you also mentioned that, and to me that's also extremely important. And Lasse coined this, and I'm stealing it, and it's basically getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. Yeah. And that's one of the key things you need to do in a room, is making sure that everyone is getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. You don't know what everybody's going to do, but you need to start acting anyway. Nor can you just, start acting and pretending you don't care what everybody else does. So you need to buy into the premise that the world is changing, other people have a say, and you need to be dynamically aware, but still pursue some sort of action or path or whatever it is, right? So, yeah.
And I want to build you, thank you for sharing that, and certainly very important being comfortable with the uncomfortable. I'd like to go back to, again, it sounds like one of our assumptions as futures practitioners is that the future is neutral. And I'm curious, Shakil, in your experiences, is that an assumption that helps to contribute to designing a more sustainable future? Or do you have a different perspective?
Yeah, I think in the spirit of the pressure cooker, I'll have a different perspective, right? Just to maybe create discomfort even among ourselves, right? I mean, I do think about subjectivity and versus objectivity, right? And I do feel that obviously we all have our subjective opinions of how we view things, right? And I think, and I won't really go into the Tagore versus Einstein debate as much, but the fact that is truth subjective, right? At the end of the day, right? Can there be objective truths in the universe? And of course, that's a basic assumption, right? Even Einstein couldn't also grapple with that, but then Tagore tried to say that truth also matters. So even I would wonder, like even in this notion that we choose that we want the truth to be neutral, the future to be neutral, is there an essence of a preferred future that we see in that as well? Like maybe there has been some sort of like, I don't know, some sort of consequences or implications that we didn't like as a result of the future not being neutral. And I do wonder that I'm sure within each of us we do have some sort of aspirations, whether it's individual or collective, that we're talking about. And I think I'm very open as a facilitator to share my own biases and opinions. I'll never pretend to be a neutral facilitator. So, for example, I'm quite open about being tackling like being anti-tobacco against the industry, right? I'll be quite open about calling out the hypocrisy of the West, for example, right? Or even maybe our own hypocrisy as well, or even issues about like where does the core of power lie in the world? Where's the periphery? So just be open about these biases, right? And I think, of course, it's up to people to engage with me because I also want to hear what they think about what I'm thinking about. So I wouldn't want to have, for example, I was just thinking out loud as we were thinking, like, what if suddenly the group decides that they want to be full genocidal, for example? Like, should I just be quiet in that room? So stuff like that plays on my mind, and I'm not sure. I don't think that's what you're saying, but I'm just trying to think about at what point do we actually own up to our own biases about what we think about where the future should go towards, right? And I think this is idea that I think about. Of course, Maslow talks about self-actualization, but this idea of collective actualization, right? Like, what is it? How does the community or the planet or a group actually feel most inspired by their own visions? And yeah, I'm not going to pretend that I have the answers to all of this, but yeah, I think those are the things that are coming up in my mind when I hear like, do I agree or disagree with the future being neutral? So for me,
I want to
yeah,
push
yeah,
it.
yeah. No,
I want to push a
go
little
ahead.
bit I want to push a little bit further because I learned so much from you and Anil and others about the role of futures in the transformation of Bangladesh. And it's very, when Manuela and I decided to write this book, the challenge that I think we all face as foresight practitioners is that it's very, very difficult to find a longitudinal case study that clearly demonstrates a process that began with a vision of a future. And we can use the word preferred or better, whatever we choose. And certainly the case of Bangladesh, I think, is exceptional in that regard. And I always thank Sohai for making the connection, because Sohai was also involved, and that was where you and he are initially connected. And now you're doing your PhD with him. I'm really curious, given your experiences with that story, how did the role of having a preferred future, which was better, given the challenges of Bangladesh in the 1960s and 70s, and the massive transformation that has occurred since then. It seems to me that on surface is a pretty good indication of the importance of not looking at the future as neutral, but actually being very, very clear that we have a shared interest of imagining and anticipating a better future for all. Is that
Yeah,
accurate,
I
or
think
am I misinterpreting the story?
no. I hope I get your question. Just fix me if I'm going in the wrong direction, right? But I think what's playing on my mind is the idea of polarities, right? That I mean, of course, I mean, in the book we talk about Sir Abid, right, from BRAC, how he started just after Bangladesh was born, his work, and of course, then we talk about Anir Bhai from Anir Chaudhry from A2I, and then we talk about, I guess, how I also got inspired by them. And of course, we also admit that it's not easy to do linear storytelling, right? I'm sure each of us were inspired by multiple different sources, and all of that. And I'm sure each of us are also not perfect beings, right? Like we each have our own like I wouldn't like there are different things that we've learned, right, across the way. I'm sure Abid had to learn certain things as he did it. Anir learned certain things. Even right now, of course, I think I just wrote it in my notes that I mean the future is still going on, right? It hasn't ended, right? The work is still going on, and of course, if you know what recent events in Bangladesh, there are different shocks that we're having to deal with, right? And and all that, and I think the reason why I talk about polarities is that, of course, I mean, like I said, like I mean, each one person. I think Lucy just mentioned one person's dream can be another person's nightmare, right? And I think, I mean, and that's the reality of things, right? Like, how do you actually manage both these polarities, right? And how do you actually guide a room where we have differing opinions? And even within ourselves, we may have that as well. And I think that's also important to interrogate, right? We have a famous Bengali philosopher singer called Lalon, who asks, he has a song which basically says how many people live in your house. So one person is like drawing the painting, one person is mixing the colors, the other person is destroying the painting. So even within ourselves, we have on the same issue, a part of us may be optimistic and another part of us may be pessimistic, right? Um, and I just, I mean, I think that's kind of what we're all having to learn is that, I mean, the whole yin and yang concept that, or the whole, whether it's light and darkness, or, I mean, are there ways to actually manage these contradictions, right? As opposed to eradicating one side completely. And I think that's a lesson that I'm trying to learn. Like, how do you actually hold these multiple beliefs, but still be able to work towards a way that I guess we at least collectively align. And I just feel that at least conversations, getting people in the same room, or the way we facilitate things, hopefully can make a slight difference, right? In terms of like at least people listening to each other, understanding each other. And then at least if that group decides, okay, maybe this is the way that we want to test it out, try it out first, maybe that helps. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think
Can
maybe
I
some of these lessons I also learned from them as well. Yeah,
can I add something? Because
sure.
what you're describing as an example of collective desirable preferred future can lead to transformation or transition. Yeah, but and I'm sure a lot of that preferable future is something that I would agree with. I mean, but this is not about whether you agree with the politics. This is about understanding that a vision of make America great again is also somebody's preferred future. And I might not agree with that. So I would be very careful to say that, oh, this is proof of evidence to lead transition or transformation. I think we have to, as futurists, we have to be very careful about that. And the future is not neutral for the simple reason that it does not exist. It only exists in our imagination. Our imagination is never neutral. So it's very subjective. And of course, you, as a facilitator, you bring your own subjectivity to any kind of space, acknowledging that is because we're all humans. We're not blank slates. We're bring our own biases, etc. And I think that's very important. And I would always defend someone's rights. I would never censor someone's imagination or try to, or censor someone's speech unless it, of course, leads to criminal behavior. I think that's very important because it might, if someone stands up and said, this is the preferred future, let's all gather around it. If it's something I like, fantastic. But if it's something that scares me, then I'm, so it's very important to keep that in mind. And I hear a lot of people say we should have a shared vision. In my opinion, that's impossible. It's just impossible. There is no there's no consensus possible of what a preferred future might look like. If you can only share your values and find even on an individual basis what you share. Maybe you're both parents, maybe you both like dogs, maybe you're both vegan, whatever. So there's always some kind of shared interest. But if it comes on a larger scale, debating futures is incredibly powerful because it helps us to understand the world around us a little bit better. That's, for me, is the most important part. And by understanding the world around us a little bit better, we get to understand each other a little bit better. And we might not lead to a preferable future because that's impossible, but it might create a reality, a present that we need. I think that's very important.
You mentioned Make America Great Again. Shakil, you mentioned Sir Abid. And just for all of our viewers, that case study is in the introduction, which has been shared with all the participants of this webinar. I'm curious, Dasha, in your experiences, going from telling a story like Make America Great Again or Sir Abid and his vision for Bangladesh, is there a way to co-create stories? Because we are talking about the planet in the context of our focus of sustainability. That is a factual reality. And Shakil, you mentioned Einstein and the rampant relativism when we do need to make decisions about more sustainable practices. Is switching from storytelling and imposing stories to story making a potential place for us to be able to come together and make the hard choices, which is characteristic of collective action leadership?
I guess the answer is yes. And just very quickly to comment on what was said before, I don't think we disagree. I think my notion of the future being neutral is that there'll be winners and losers in everyone, and someone is going to like it and someone's not going to like it, right? So that's primarily it. But I think maybe it boils down to being able to facilitate empathy, right? To minimize that, reduce the gap between the way people see the world. So I fully agree that we all come at it with our own subjectivity and we do stand for something, etc. But I do think maybe it's more about facilitating empathy within the group, because then maybe they will, we can bring the worldviews a little bit closer. As to, storytelling and creating, I think
basically the example you mentioned, what the story that you brought to that group didn't resonate, it didn't land. Any reflections on why, what you might have done differently?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, some of you remember that there ultimately, a couple of years later, there was a vessel that was actually stuck in the Suez Canal, luckily from a different company. And so it was plausible. And I admit I had a small I told you so moment. I'm that small a person. But I think afterwards, I had a lot of reflection on how could I leave the room with them dismissing the story, basically, right? So looking back, what I could have done differently was probably embark them on the journey there. And then, so basically the journey towards whatever story I was telling, and then have them as part of that. So basically then they couldn't actually dismiss the outcome, right? Then it became more natural. Presenting them with the destination, basically it was just full rejection. So I think for me, it was more, and I think I opened up with that saying, it's about how is it going to make people feel? How can I counter that feeling by design of the process or the session or their involvement? Or how can I, if I can't do either of those, then how can I soften the blow? Because what am I trying to tell them something, or am I trying to make them internalize and actually do something about it? And I think the same goes for futures, right? So if you just share, I mean, it's been a while since John Lennon wrote his song, right? Imagine. And it was a wonderful song, and everybody's buying into the message. And I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but he didn't really tell us how, right? He just said, imagine all of this has happened. And that's, I guess that's for me an example of, yeah, the message is still positive, but we've done very little to get there. And we've taken so many steps back. So 50 years down, we like the song, but it didn't come with a manual.
It's actually interesting, because in the 60s, early 70s, he and George Harrison, correct me if I'm wrong, they actually had an event in New York City, I believe it was for some of the victims of flooding in Bangladesh. So there was an act to try to make something happen, to engage people. And so that song, very much a story, was probably something, at least in a very modest way, to contribute to making change on the ground.
But imagine no possessions, right? We've never owned more than we do today. So
Indeed. Shakil?
It wasn't the flooding. It was the genocide in 1971. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. No worries. Just putting it out there, because it's also not officially recognized.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I'd like to continue with this idea of what are the stories that engage people? What are the ways that we as practitioners can use stories which are certainly reflective of biases? They certainly help. Lucy had mentioned the importance of an image. A story is an image to be able to respond and react to. Luce, could you tell us a little bit about your experiences with the work that you did in Nigeria with Oxfam? What was the overarching story, and how were you able to make that story a part of the education and cultivation of collaboration for change in that part of the world?
Yeah, that's a very, it sounds like a simple question, but it's a very long and layered answer, but I'll keep it short. Basically, this was a project that was called Work in Progress, and it was from Oxfam, sponsored mostly by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. And this project was a 3-year project where youth in Somalia, Egypt, and Nigeria, and we work mostly in Nigeria, youth to educate them or teach them the skills to create new jobs, new industries. I mean, Africa is the youngest, fastest growing continent with a lot of youth unemployed. Nigeria is a very young country, and very soon they're entering the job market. And how do they create new industries, etc. So it was a lot about entrepreneurship, and future literacy came into the mix for them to. In the beginning, it was kind of the story. Okay, so they can like imagine a future, design it and execute it, etc. Very hands-on and practical. So we were brought in to be to design a curriculum for youth, but we very soon discovered that we have to start with educators, and it's not us teaching them anything. We have to step into this pulsing, complex, incredible context and really figure out what is most needed here on the ground. So the story of us with some other partners designing curriculum for schools really came change halfway through, thinking, what is it? Maybe we should talk about how they see the future of Nigeria on a much broader scale, and let's just start facilitating and sharing these stories of where they see this is going, because maybe we're just making all these assumptions from a developmental program pumping money into something for 3 years. So we just kind of left our initial ideas behind and started talking to youth there, to teachers and educators, management. How do you see Nigeria in 50, 60 years? And what is so interesting is that it's always comes this collective story coming up. And from the Netherlands, very highly individualist country, it's all about self-reflection. Where do I see myself, and how would I look in 50 years, and will I still have a job? And very almost self-centered in that sense. But in Nigeria, it's very much about the collective, and for them, they and some of the assumptions they had, it was difficult for them to imagine almost like kind of a blooming country that has no help whatsoever. And so it took a lot of imagination and exercises to come up with stories that was very empowering, especially for young people. So the youth there felt so amazed that someone would actually ask them that question. That's what do you think, not but what do you think as a collective? So we changed the story, and we thought, what we need here is that whatever we're trying to do with future literacy, it needs to be heavily contextualized in this cultural context, because the stuff that we come in, whether it's the symbols or the metaphors or the exercises, all the heuristics, that just needs to change. And this is not, we have some tools, but we really need to do this together. So we decided to shift the focus from basically educating to setting up a center in Lagos with a research component, a community action component, and a teaching component, and working with a local partner, Poise Nigeria, an educational training center, for them to set up and really design it, and in a way that was just really helpful for that context. And then everything just turned out to be, of course, completely different. And that, I think you can have all these plans and stories, but ultimately coming in and working, it's all about, from the moment we started this project, it's really about letting go of what we're trying to do, and it's about deep listening. And I think that that organization, Nigeria, is now, they have been running several labs and trainings and labs, all doing it completely, into that particular context, which I think is fantastic. So, and every time, and how long I've been doing this, every time I'm amazed how much more I can let go, and how much I'm still attached to certain stories. And stories change as well. The moment you tell a story, it's not yours anymore. It travels, it lands somewhere else. It becomes part of the space, the energy. And I think that's instead of, besides rethinking the kind of stories we're telling, we also need to rethink how we're telling stories. Storytelling in itself is very important as well. So I've moved away from talking about the future of stories to the future of storytelling. Is that it's not always verbal, it's not always unscripted, it's not always one person to another. It's sometimes it just changes the moment. You construct it, it's already different. So yeah.
Well, wonderful. And it's wonderful to hear the impact of your work and how it's taken on its own life, which is really why we do this work. Shakil, Loes mentioned the role of culture, of changing stories, and particularly that educational component as well. I'm curious to hear if you've got a story and some insights from either your work or research, particularly in Asia, how culture, and I love that polarity between the collective and individual, how has that been playing out in your work and research?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are different ways in which, obviously, of course, the workshop is one methodology, and I think even myself, I usually introduce myself as a futurist, an educator, and a storyteller, right? And I think I even remember the reason why I started calling myself as a storyteller, because I think I met Keulai Kamara, who's also a futurist slash storyteller, and I think his name means storyteller or something, or at least they have this tradition in Sierra Leone where it's like they're generations of storytellers. So it's their responsibility to pass down the stories for one generation. So that definitely gave me, and of course, causal layered analysis. When my first workshop with Sahel and Atullah was obviously a good way to see how stories fit in, because of course when I was in school I would do theater on the side or in university, but then having like an understanding of the agency of art explicitly was definitely quite powerful. And I think a lot of my work I try to communicate that as well, like the importance of understanding the story. I think a lot of us do that as well. And yeah, and I think I mean, it's always great to kind of discuss stories that are that are not told, right? So, for example, we do have like a lot of conflict between the political parties back home, but we don't have a single story where like youth among these political parties, they decided to work together and end up doing something good. There's not a single story out there, not in popular theater, drama, or any way that story exists. But that story has to come out somehow, right? Otherwise, we're going to keep on being in this vicious cycle of and conflict. And I think I even like the fact that this idea about like how we get there, right? Even I think even also being able to play stories around like that. So a lot of my work, I mean, we also do obviously like some role playing if we have the time, and role playing not just the actual vision, but even the journey of how we get there as well, so that at least there's some things that get etched in the mind, right? And I think I do believe that I mean, I hear storytelling. I know the importance of story listening and story making, but even the how do we actually embody these stories as well, right? And I think and not just listening to a story with your eyes and ears, but with your multiple senses, right? Because I guess the more your neural networks are kind of engaged with the story, so when it comes to flash decision making, maybe that will play at the back of your mind, right? And I think yeah, and I don't know obviously whether there's a right or wrong story. It's a story that we decide to work towards too. But we do kind of can come to a common understanding that these current stories are not helping us get to where we want to go, right? And I think so.
Trying to
Therefore,
create those better
the
stories.
question, yeah,
Yeah,
how
no,
do we
definitely.
what should be those all? Yeah,
And it's wonderful that you mentioned the importance of embodiment. We spoke in the earlier session with Zohai, Lisa, and Lassa about the importance of embodied foresight and using that as a critical experience in anticipating better futures. So reminding us how important that embodiment, that we're engaging all of our senses, not just our intellect, is important, particularly when we're trying to
yeah,
co-create stories is essential. You would also mention some of the political aspects, which, you know, as we see, unfortunately, unfolding in places like Bangladesh and all over the world. Dasha, your background, your current work at the geopolitical level, I'm curious to hear your insights on how do you cultivate collaboration? How do you make stories to be able to mobilize leadership at a geopolitical level?
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting question. As Shakil and Loes, you guys were talking, I had this philosophical question in my mind. Somewhere we're actually caught in this. We can't even agree about history, right? So history is a story, and it's told in so many different ways. So we can't even agree about a narrative of something that has happened. So question is it easier to agree on something that hasn't happened than it is on something that has happened? And I don't have the answer, but I think it's an interesting question because, you know, because we're out advocating right now that we should teach futures as we teach history, because it is just stories, right? And just to maybe to underpin how important it is, what we all do is we can look at how much history shapes societies and people and beliefs and their future visions, right? Because somehow there's a linear projection for many that where we're coming from, where we are today, and then you can extend it into the future. So I think that storytelling, just, you know, a life hack. If we can't convince people that a story about the future is important, we can look back and say, well, look how much it matters what we told ourselves in the past.
Right.
Whether it's the Vikings or, God forbid, you were a country that started a war and it haunts you 100 years later, whatever it is. It's in us, generation through generation. So
A collective trauma.
exactly, or identity or whatever it is, right? Which only makes it more important to say, okay, well then something that the future is something we create. So let's do something we'll be proud of, all of us, right? So that was just a side note. Also, I think fully agreeing with Loes said, and I guess both of you said, you know, assuming you know what other people want is extremely dangerous, especially, and I fully agree with you, I know it, but I still do it. And, you know, whether it's down to discussing with your kids, you think what's best for them always, or you're talking to clients or whatever it is. So I think that's extremely important. back to your question about the geopolitical reality. I think as unfortunately we have a lot of peace talks going on, right? Which means we have a lot of wars. And I think to me, any peace negotiation is actually a negotiation about the future, because there's two parties who sees the future differently, or the future they want, and they need to agree on something, which is also why the neutrality part comes in, because if you're a facilitator of these talks, you need to be able to facilitate the discussion between these two conflicting futures without weighing in, because then you'll skew somehow the outcome. So I think the future is an extremely important element when it comes to geopolitical outlooks, because the world, I mean, where we find ourselves right now is, there's this piece of art, I don't remember the artist, unfortunately, but a neon sign saying the present moment used to be a recently unimaginable future, right? And I think that's a very good reminder that whatever is going to happen a year from now, right now it's day by day, but it's something we can already imagine now. And if not influence, then at least our actions can reflect the future we want. So I think in geopolitics, it's extremely important for any country, especially smaller countries where we are now, to start looking at geopolitics as a futuristic exercise, because it's something that we'll all be exposed to. We'll all be part of it, as we're one globe. And it's something we can still shape in one way or another, at least by our own actions and intentions. So I think as much as it's sometimes future studies and foresight is not taken in as part of the formal system, we see it's being picked up more and more. So we're doing a lot with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has taken in the discipline and saying we need it in our geopolitical analysis. We think that's great, because there's no way predicting, but you should certainly be prepared. And I don't know if I answered your question, but I do think but just peace talks alone are actually a negotiation about the future.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your reminder of the past. How many of us as futurists or foresight practitioners like to focus on the future's cone? Well, the actual future's cone actually had the past cone as well, which somehow gets truncated in most versions. So I think you're a reminder of that past comes with us. So we need to be able to look backward to look forward. And we as practitioners, and was very fortunate to be able to talk about a number of practitioners in the book, always seeing ourselves in the middle, past towards the future, to be able to reflect on both simultaneously. With that, I'd love to hear, Loes, your just kind of recommendation. How do you mobilize your own leadership? How do you mobilize yourself to be able to be in the middle of that cone to make an impact on whatever future you believe that you and your stakeholders aspire to?
How do I mobilize myself? Well, I think we're all futurists in the sense that we're all used to future all the time. So even whether it's peace talks, not just on a daily basis, or even my dog, right? So we're all using the future, we're all anticipating. I think just a lack of awareness how we're doing it. That's how I see my role. It's just facilitating spaces where people become more aware of how powerful the future is, and how to engage and think about and imagine in a more responsible way that just reflects their values. How do I mobilize? I think I'm by constantly reassessing my own futures literacy, I think is very important. I often don't know. I'm just as confused or about the complexity and uncertainty of things, and I think that's very important. Future literacy is, yes, it's about using futures to see the present anew, so to enhance your perception of the present, to be open to emergence, and that to me is being vulnerable. You cannot be open to emergence without being vulnerable. You cannot be open to the present and not have that vulnerability. So for me, that is always very important, that any kind of leadership position I have or not have, I think it's very, very important to start with self-reflection. So that how are my actions? What are my values? If I'm disturbed or uncomfortable with a certain disruption or certain event happening in society, I just always check with myself, why did I think this would never happen? What was I assuming to begin with? And was that a fair assumption? Is it true? And if it's not true, why was I thinking that? So for me, it really starts with there. And the other thing I would say, as being a pioneer in a higher educational institute that is, kind of traditional in its system, I would say, and traveling all over the world and being all these places, I think it's just do this in an inviting, gracious manner. Not lecture anybody how things should be done, but just invite people and say that, hey, let's learn here in this space together. I think I have some tools and some knowledge and wisdom on how to do that. But like when I was when I'm teaching students, I always trust that people are there to learn as well. And so I always want to step into that space with people together. I think that's how I would describe my own leadership. And I think ultimately, innovation starts with an invitation.
Oh, wonderful. Loes, thank you for sharing that balance between self-reflection, humility, and also what you refer to quite often, the radical hope that we all need. Shakil, question to you. How do you mobilize yourself for those better futures?
I think obviously I'm inspired by people like Paulo Freire, right, who talks about pedagogy of the oppressed, right? And I think he talks about this notion of praxis being in this constant cycle of reflection and action, reflection and action. So it's not enough just to talk about the future, but you need to also act in the present, right? And I think it's doing a bit of both, right? And of course, like even sometimes we do a good workshop, right? Sometimes if there are action items in the present that I personally resonated, I'd like to go on the journey sometimes. But again, you take the time to reflect and if you don't mind me quickly sharing, right? I think you asked the question on geopolitics as well, right? And I think even I mean, of course, growing up, we had only a little bit of a view of what happened before 1971, right? Like we didn't know much about like the atrocities of British colonization, for example, right? We only got to learn as we grew up because the British Council was teaching us, so they wouldn't teach us those things, right? And then, but then as we grew up, you learn from Shashithar other things, but then you also learn about how people who are oppressed in Europe as well, in UK, their difficulties as well, and then you find solidarity with people across the globe, right? Because it's sometimes easy to get annoyed at something, right? And then increasingly, I do believe in this whole transnational movement, right? Transnational politics, a transnational movement that there are. So even when you read Thomas Piketty, you also know that the bottom 50% for the last 200 years, the inequality in wealth hasn't changed, irrespective of all the things we talk about, poverty, alleviation, and all that. There's no difference in rich or poor countries all over the world. So you think that our systems have been designed such that these things kind of exist, and if you can find solidarity among different people, then I think then you decide how do you actually use whatever you have in your belt, like whether it's futures, whether it's systems thinking, design thinking, pedagogy, and increasingly I've also tried to look into my own culture as well. Like what are some cultural rich practices that already exist? Like for example, Adda is one. Like Adda means to hang out and chill out and discuss something at length. Or for example, there's Tabligh, the idea that it's religious preaching, but people can also, instead of religious preaching, you can also go to different spaces in your community and just chit chat with people, right, about a topic and all that. For example, the Jummah right now has become quite strict, but it's basically a Friday congregation where in the past it was about just discussing about what are the issues in our community that we need to solve and all that. So of course, I'm also gaining more language as I learn my own culture as well. And I guess for every community, I think there's something that obviously we can share with each other, but also trying to learn that. And I think we've heard about the future cylinder as well, right? It's like there are multiple presents, multiple futures, and multiple history. So yeah, I think a recommendation. I think I'll probably end with Michael Jackson's quotation that if you want to make the world a better place, you got to take a look at yourself and make that change, right? So that's definitely introspection is definitely important.
Wonderful, Shakil.
But
Thank you for sharing. Don't
yeah.
worry, we're not going to ask you to sing. That'll be for the
Okay,
next
no worries.
webinar. But I really appreciate those community rituals that are embedded in the culture and represented by language is very important. I think that's something we can all dig into, our own cultures and where we find that. Dasha, final word, your reflections, personal or other.
Yeah, and I think I shared this in another podcast, and she's going to hate it, but it's actually my stepdaughter who would usually be my check and balance on my own biases. I think if you can't go to a different continent or engage with people who see the world completely, try to talk to a grown-up teenager and just realize how differently she sees it, because she's at the age where she's a fully reflective adult now. she's graduated from being difficult to a point where we can actually have these conversations. But the way she sees the world, the way she sees a better future, the way she sees what's wrong with society now, etc., is so different from even and we exist in the same space. We exist in the same time, but we exist in a different space. So I think for me, if a stark reminder and a very quick future check-in is talk to someone who's in their late teens, maybe early 20s, while they're still challenging conventional wisdom and they're articulate enough to actually be able to defend their views. So that's my life hack. I check with her.
Fantastic. No, that's wonderful. And it really brings us full circle.
Good advice.
When we started the webinar, how can we listen more? How can we be more authentic? How do we bring that humility? And it's having those kinds of interactions with the people closest to you. It's wonderful. Fantastic. Well, I want to thank all of you, particularly those Shakil, for having the opportunity to learn with you in writing the book. It's been an incredible experience. The intention of these three webinars has been not to sell books, but to have these kinds of conversations. There's a lot of tools and methods that are in the book, but there are many, many more that are outside of the book. It's not about tools and methods. It's about having this kind of conversation, sharing with each other, and also inspiring all of us to be more active in designing sustainable futures. So I would like to thank all of you who have been part of the webinar series. Again, I want to thank the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies for hosting this. And I think we all look forward to continuing the conversation in whatever format, in whatever community, and with anyone who is passionate about making the world a better place. Now, Shakil, you can start saying it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Better
Thank you for
place.
inviting us.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Oh, sounds good.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.